So welcome everyone to Teach the Showas, sharing their stories, Women's Solidarity, a special program for Women's History Month and International Women's Day. I am Dr. Deborah Frick, the Executive Director of Teach the Showa, and I want to introduce you to our storytellers tonight. Lynne Feldman, wave Lynne. Lynne is our Teach the Showa's international coordinator and director of Holocaust scholarship. Karen Weber, Cantor Karen Weber, wave Karen. Karen is our resident poet and liturgist. And Shifra Poupko, wave Shifra. Shifra is one of our very special storytellers coming to tonight from Israel, which is very exciting for us. And I want to introduce also here Jennifer Zunikov, wave Jennifer. Jennifer is our storytelling director and will be monitoring the chat for us. We will end with a question and answer. So if you have questions as we go through, then you can put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the program. So I'm going to start myself and tell you a little bit about what we're doing today. So women's solidarity during the Holocaust is a complex and diverse topic that's receiving an increasing amount of academic attention recently. It's critical to acknowledge the acts of solidarity and resistance that occurred, particularly among women. During the Holocaust, women faced unique challenges and vulnerabilities, but they also demonstrated remarkable resilience and solidarity in many ways, including resistance activities and creating support networks. Having these support networks provided women not just with unity and strength, but also with emotional support and practical assistance. Women relied on each other for comfort and survival in the face of the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust. By highlighting women's solidarity, resilience, and resistance, scholars aim to challenge traditional narratives of victimhood and passivity, and to underscore the agency and humanity of those who lived through this dark period in history. Telling some of these stories allows us to honor not just the women whose stories we will be hearing tonight, but also the solidarity which crossed barriers of language, background, upbringing, age, and belief systems. Today, we are doing something really special. We are going to hear the stories of two women who came from different backgrounds, but created a friendship in the Ravensbruck concentration camp. So we're going to be hearing the same story from three different perspectives, essentially. Ravensbruck was a unique camp, as it was an all-women's camp in Germany. At its peak, it had approximately 132,000 female prisoners. In 1942, Siemens opened factories in and near the camp, and most of the women in Ravensbruck were forced to work at these factories. Our journey today begins many years past the Holocaust and far away from Ravensbruck. Our journey begins at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, in Israel. Shifra will start us off with the story of Haviva Peled-Carmeli, the former artifact department manager at Yad Vashem. Shifra?
Good evening. Can you hear me, Deborah? Yeah, great. It started with a phone call from a woman named Yehudit Aufrichtig. And the phone call came to my office as the head of the Department of Artifacts at Yad Vashem. This woman who I had never met said that she had a recipe book from Ravensbruck. And I was intrigued by this idea that women had come together and created a book about food, sharing details of recipes in a concentration camp. As the director, I've heard of male artifacts that they've collected. For example, we have this book, a calendar, where men had created times of prayer and candle lighting, but I had never seen anything like that for women. So I knew that I was onto something, and I asked Yehudit if I could visit her. I went to her house, and when I finally got to when she opened the door and I saw her, she was this beautiful 80-year-old woman without a wrinkle on her face and no gray hair. She invited me in, and we sat down on her couch. Very quickly, she showed me what appeared to be this old, scattered scrapbook. And inside were handwritten recipes from different women who were in her bunk. And Haviva started laughing. I started laughing, and Yehudit started laughing because we both realized the absurdity of all of this. She was basically trying to explain to me how women, in their worst moments, decided that if they were going to create recipes, they were going to go big. So the quantities of cream and butter, the details of challah bread and rice souffle, you could almost taste them as they read out each and every ingredient. She said that she wanted to donate this to Yad Vashem. And at a loss of words, I said, thank you. And as I was about to leave, Yehudit started her story of liberation. She says, I have one more thing I want to show you. So she goes into her bedroom and she comes out and sits next to me. And she's holding this tiny red, what looked like a kerchief. She explained that on the day of liberation, everybody was so weak and exhausted, but that as the soldiers were coming in, they had taken a Nazi flag and ripped it down and tore it in two. And they had passed it amongst the women in the bunk. And each woman wrote her name on the flag. She said, maybe this was just a way to remember everybody. But then another woman, she traded her bread for a needle and thread and began to sew the autographs of all of the women into the Nazi flag. She said, do you want this for the museum? And of course, I was at a loss for words. She says, I want Yad Vashem to have this, but only on condition. I said, okay. She said, after the soldiers arrived, my best friend Edith, who was more sick and more tired than I had ever seen her, they took her away to the clinic, and I've never seen her again. Could you maybe help me find her, track her down? I took the Ravensbruck recipe book and I said, I will do everything in my power to help you find Edith. And I left.
Thank you, Shifra. And now, Lynne will continue our story with Yehudit's story.
Thank you. I was born in 1914 in Hungary. I grew up in Hungary and I went to university in Debrecen. I studied languages and history. But in 1937, under the Numerus Clausus Act, I was kicked out of university. And I didn't really know what I could do. Where would I go? But I speak languages, and I found a family in Holland, in the Netherlands, a Jewish family, and they were looking for a nanny. So I moved. And I worked with this family up until 1941. The Germans, they occupied the previous year. And for the first few months of occupation, I was still able to work and the family could still pay me. But after a good few months, the family had to let me go. So I left. I needed more work. But I knew languages. So I found work as an assistant to the Hungarian ambassador to Amsterdam. The ambassador, he was nice. He also gave me a passport, a diplomatic one, even though I was only his assistant. I wasn't really a diplomat. This passport came in very, very useful. The passport didn't have the letter J on it. Nowhere did it say that I was Jewish. So I also found myself joining resistance. And because I had this diplomatic passport, I could roam around Amsterdam. Nobody really paid attention to me. And I used to take papers with me for other Jews who needed papers. The resistance was very good at sourcing anything and everything that I needed. And I did this for nearly 3 years. On the 5th of June, 1944, somebody, till today, I don't know who the somebody is, somebody snitched. Somebody told the Gestapo that I was a Jew. Within days, I found myself in Germany in an all-women's camp called Ravensbruck. In the barrack, there were women from all sorts of different countries. I could communicate with most of them. Again, studied languages. But there was one woman who really, within hours of me arriving into the barrack, there was something in her. We became best friends, inseparable. Edith Gombush. So Edith managed to arrange that I would be on the same factory work as her in Simmons. Simmons had factories inside our camp, but also outside. And different women, even from our own barrack, worked in different parts of the factories. But Edith made sure that we would be together. So every day, we'd wake up really early in the morning, leave our barrack, march towards the factory, do our work, and come back in the evening. Every evening, we all sat together, all the women, usually on our bunk. We shared a bunk, Edith and I. So we would sit on the bunk and we would have this colored liquid, right? They called it some days soup and some days they called it coffee, but literally brown water. That is what we had. And we had one piece of bread with marge. And in the evenings, we would huddle together, munching on our bread, drinking the brown liquid. And we would talk about food from home. Every woman had their favorite cake, their favorite meal, their favorite starter, their favorite kind of pastry. And the more we talked about it, the more we realized that it doesn't just pass our time, but it makes us forget for about 2.5 minutes of talking about delicious other kind of food. It makes us forget that we're having bread with margarine and brown liquid. Edith and I came up with an idea. We're going to write down these recipes. Not any recipe, right? Just the ones that we think are worthy to go into our Ravensbruck fantasy recipe book. We stole from Simmons, we stole this big brown paper sack, folded it up, and took it with us. Edith, one day, she traded a piece of bread for a pencil. I traded my piece of bread the following day for a needle and some thread. And we cut up this big brown sack into a little booklet. And the two of us, we picked which recipes would go in. And some woman would come saying, no, but my recipe, that's the best recipe. It should be in the book. But maybe we didn't really like that kind of food that she was talking about. At the end, we put them all in, to the extent that we had to have a second little booklet. They were quite small. So again, we had to steal another sack, but we did, and that was fine. Every night, this became the highlight. This is what we were waiting for every day. In the factory, we waited to come back, talk about the food, write the recipes, and then also look back and read them again. Liberation came almost a year later. Edith wasn't too well. She was in the infirmary. But somehow I managed to be liberated with another 7,000 women who were taken to Sweden. But before we left, we tore down a flag, the Nazi flag. Something good has to come from this disgusting red flag with the swastika. We tore it up into two parts. And we passed the flag around the two parts. All the women signed it. And one of the women who was really good with embroidery, she traded a piece of bread so that she could get more thread for the needle that I got months earlier. And she embroidered them. And Edith and I both signed each other's flags. We each had one. I never got to say goodbye because we were rushed off by the Red Cross to Sweden. And I never knew what happened to Edith. I got better in Sweden. I got stronger. And I decided that I was moving to Israel. And I got to Israel and I met my husband, lovely man. And I kept my recipe book and my embroidered Nazi flag. I kept them in a drawer next to my bed. Once in a while, I'd read through it and laugh because I remembered these extreme amounts that we wrote in these recipes. Could you imagine trying to make a rice souffle for a family with half a kilo of sugar? Who would eat that today? But at the time when we wrote it, half a kilo sugar, half a kilo gold, it's the same thing, isn't it? But I miss Edith, and I want to know what happens to her. Where she is, did she get married? Did she have children? One day I'll find her. One day.
So let's continue and get Edith's story from Karen.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the Jewish Sydney Museum. I can say I'm happy to be here, but I can't say I can't believe I am here, because I know I am. Pinch. I do believe it. I willed it and planned it. It was my intention and fervent hope that I be here to address you today. But now that I am reunited with this magical little book just here in my hand, I must say I'm a bit overwhelmed. The carefully formed letters, Ravensbruck 1945. And this fragile little book, her pages stolen from the work in my office. The blue chicken scratch may seem like scribble to you, but the nub of the indigo pencil magically captured German and Hungarian. The letters mystically fly off the page like Torah. Even if you cannot understand them, you must know you are in the presence of blue and white fire. You must know the words themselves are holy. And know this, held in these pages are the sacred memories of the women who wrote the book. I am but one, and now I am struck by each page now, a wonder, a world unto itself from a lifetime ago. The 2 mushrooms dot the front cover, wild, not poisonous, just the garden variety, you know, the eating kind. The Nazis could starve us slowly, but could not poison our imaginations. Recalling our favorite recipes that propelled us back to our childhood kitchens, the overpowering smell of thick sauces, simmering in large cooking pots, sugar thickening the air and settling in the pleats of our skirts and in our braids. This cooking book of cardboard and thread, weighing virtually nothing, kept the pilot light on, kept us human. 56 pages containing the secret to our survival. Now, you must understand how desperately cold and hungry we were, and the little time we stole in the evening or a Sunday afternoon. We spoke of food, marbled meats swimming in gravy, stick-to-the-ribs goulash, Transylvania cabbage, mushroom caps filled with chicken liver. Swallowing our saliva, we brought the gourmet fantasy meal to life and got up from the table feeling full. The simple act of sitting together, of retelling. We clung to the idea that maybe we would see our families again. Maybe we would see our beloveds again. And provided we survived, we dared to form the question, under what circumstances will our lives continue? Now let's see. Apricot dumpling. Well, this is somewhat unusual because it's sweet and savory. We grate the potatoes with 1 egg, pinch salt, butter to form a dough, and then we knead. Do you feel the chili on your hands? Yes, we form a ball. Then we flatten it and place half an apricot inside, in plain sight. Fill it with sugar. Cover with the other half of the apricot. Wrap the dough around it like a pocket. Then we crimp the edges to form a perfect dumpling. Steam it or boil it in salt water until cooked. Yes, you will know when it's cooked. And then you're going to take the dumplings, roll them in sugar, cinnamon, and breadcrumbs, coat well. Place them in hot butter of a skillet. Sizzle and serve hot. The rations at Ravensbruck were designed to starve us slowly, but talking about food pointed us toward the future. Now, in this book, desserts were the real stars, the meringues, the mousses, the layer cakes. Here's a lovely one. It is a Kaiserschmarrn pancake. It's shredded pancake. Take a heavy cast iron skillet, 2 large mixing bowls. In one, separate the 4 eggs, 4 gorgeous shiny yellow orbs from their glistening wet whites. Pour the silken flour, the cold milk, the vanilla sugar, and the rum. And my favorite, the raisins. Beat into a golden batter. Add a pinch of salt. And then in a second bowl, beat sugar to stiff white peaks. And then turn over the bowl onto the head of your neighbor. No. Fold together gently into one batter. And then pour into the skillet. Let it sizzle one large pancake. Drink in the smell. One large circle divided into 4 wedges. Gently flip each section of the whole pancake and continue dividing and dividing and dividing down into ever smaller pieces. Keep adding sugar until the pan of bite-sized pillow pieces, you pour it out onto a fancy plate. Sprinkle it with powdered sugar. Serve hot with jam. Ah, these table dreamings were subversive acts. We were at once dreamers and dissidents who came to the camp speaking different languages, but once there, all spoke the language of food. Some remembered Shabbat, Sabbath. Some remembered Rosh Hashanah. And we passed these memories down from grandmothers to daughters to bunkmates. It was like cracking a code. Obviously, no precise measurements. No, that was not the point. On these pages are delicious approximations, hints, like a shorthand. I was young. I didn't know how to cook yet. I didn't even know how to make an egg. I ate the words of others. In the camp, there was a tradition, a ritual involving passing around a bowl of solidarity, and everyone at the table would put in a spoonful of their soup. Then we would give the bowl to the woman who needed it most that day. Food bound us together. One day, when my dearest friend Yehudit was ill and missed the daily bread distribution, I brought the bread to her with a note attached. It read, "Dear Julie, I'm very sorry that we didn't spend the day together in our lovely hall and didn't have our meals together. To allow you to get at least some mental pleasure from our meals, I'll give you the details of the menu. Breakfast. Carlsbad-style breakfast, eggs, butter, cheese, and jam. Brunch. At 10 o'clock, we had a yogurt, langus, a deep-fried yeast pastry, and a radish. Lunch. Potato soup with sour cream and laurel leaves, asparagus in sour cream and breadcrumbs, sunny-side-up egg and beef in tomato sauce with macaroni, fried apple in vanilla sauce for dessert. Afternoon snack, chocolate milk with whipped cream and egg bread with almonds and a hornet's nest. This is a type of cake. Supper, marrow, fried potatoes with onion, salad with green onion, little cookies and black coffee and fruit. We gorged ourselves and ate everything apart from a little slice of bread, which we saved for you.
So let us come back, having heard both Yehudit and Edith, to Haviva.
I never forgot my promise that I had made to Yehudit, but this was years ago, before Facebook, and tracking down Edith was nearly impossible. Then one day I was giving a tour in the museum to a journalist, and we get to the recipe book, and I'm telling him about it, and he said, "Wait, but this isn't the original." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "No, I've seen the original. It's actually in Australia." Now, I was completely taken back by this because, of course, I had received the recipe book myself from Yehudit. But I began a long search. So I started to fax the different museums until I eventually got to the Holocaust Museum in Sydney. And I sent them on letterhead from Yad Vashem asking if they in fact have a Ravensbruck recipe book. And I get a response back by fax that they do. So I asked again, sent them another fax, and I said, can I ask who donated this artifact? And they said, yes, a woman by the name of Edith Peer. So I responded, is Edith Peer by chance Edith Gombush? And I got a fax back with all capital letters and 3 exclamation points, yes. So I was thrilled. I had finally found Edith. And I decided to call Yehudit. So she picked up the phone and I said, hi, Edith, it's Haviva. I've got a question for you. What would you do if you were able to find Edith? And she said, well, I would go and visit her immediately. And I said, well, what if she lived very far away? And she said, well, I would just have my husband drive me. And I said, well, what if it's really, really far away? And she said, well, I suppose I can talk to her on the phone. And I was able to tell her that we had found her, that she lived in Sydney, Australia. And a few weeks later, she called me to say that she had just had her first phone conversation with her best friend. They hadn't spoken in over 50 years, but they picked up right where they left off, like 2 good girlfriends who had only just slightly missed each other. They spoke nearly every day. They spoke on the phone and they wrote letters. And in fact, they wrote those letters in English so that I had the incredible opportunity to read the correspondence between these 2 best friends who had shared a lifetime together in such a short period of time and then lost contact for 50 years. In 2003, Yehudit passed away, and 2 weeks later, so did Edith. But when our museum opened in 2005, I was able to put 2 very special artifacts together. Right before the museum opened, Yehudit's husband came to visit me, and he said, I know Yehudit would have wanted you to have this. And he handed me the red Nazi flag with the embroidered names of the women on it. So today, if you go into our museum, you can see the recipe book right next to the red kerchief, the Nazi flag with the names. And we're able to tell a story, not just about having a glimpse into the life of women during the times of the Holocaust, but we're also able to tell an incredible story about what kept people alive, about women's solidarity and the strength that they gave to each other to get through that time.
What an amazing set of stories. I am blown away. I am going to actually, let's spotlight all 4 of us so that we can have a conversation about this. The solidarity that we're hearing about is just mind-blowing, and the stories and the way they came out and connected, and I'm just blown away. Yes, so I actually just asked Lynne if she could get us a picture of the flag. Can we also get a picture of the recipe book, Lynne?
Yes, give me a few minutes and I'll pop it in for us.
So Lynne is going to find us pictures of both of those. In the meantime, let's talk to our storytellers a little bit about the process of making these. I know people have started writing appreciations in the chat already. I invite you to write appreciations in the chat. And Shifra, since you're still here and haven't had to go take care of your kids yet, why don't we start with you? That was a beautiful representation of the connection and the job of Yad Vashem to be the place where these things come together. And I really, and the personality of the collections man, the artifacts manager, whose sort of passion is to bring these things out and to bring them together. Tell us a little bit about the process of making this story.
Okay. Well, like you said when you introduced me, I am a guide and an educator at Yad Vashem. And it's very easy for people who walk through there for their first time to imagine that all of this stuff sort of just appears, right? But the reality is that each and every photograph, each and every artifact has in and of itself its own story. And very often we forget that because sometimes simple things like a kerchief or eyeglasses or a little star, all of this stuff often will stay in someone's attic for years. Or is it given away because they want to hold on to it themselves until they themselves pass. So I think as a guide, being able to share not only the history of the Holocaust and how the story unfolds through the museum, but to choose one or two artifacts that have these incredible stories with them. Because for me, that is about giving each person having a name. And so when I can even go into a deeper level, right? If that's our mission, is that it's not just 6 million, it's not a number, but it's 1 + 1 + 1, and making sure that those stories, those individual stories, have an impact and are able to be told is so critical to the work that we do. And I think it's just a lovely way of presenting one or two artifacts. That's really all that you have. You know, we have over 20,000 in the museum, so you can't do it all. But when Lynne asked me to say the story of Haviva, it was very easy to sort of slip into that because we forget that there are people who have this job. Their job is to sort of collect or uncover these hidden gems that we have in museums, not only in Israel, but all over the world. So it was very easy to sort of slip into that. And to also, I think, an unsung hero of Holocaust history are the people who work behind the scenes, working tirelessly to sort of find a menorah, find this artifact, you know, so it was very, very easy for me.
Find this person, yes. So I want to ask you one other question, which is, I know telling these stories in first person does not come necessarily easily to you. This came out so beautifully in first person. You want to speak to what made this story easier to tell in first person?
So it's a great question. I would say closer in time, chronologically, it seemed much easier to sort of make that connection. And I'm working in Holocaust education. I imagined Haviva and I would have had a great conversation had we sat down for coffee. Her passions seem to work with mine. And so that was really, really great. I think one of the hardest parts about going into first person with survivors is just that level of pain and that level of being able to go there, which is very complicated and it can be problematic. So it was much easier for me to sort of tap into somebody from the other side behind the scenes than that.
Yes. Well, thank you. It was wonderful. And as I said, marvelously framing the two stories of the survivors. Lynne, I have heard pieces of that story. I don't know if I've ever heard the whole story all the way through, and I love it. The detail of how it all comes together just just wonderful. Tell us a little bit about this story and what it means to you and what it means to tell it all as compared to the little bits that we usually get, and what drew you to this story.
So I have to start with the fact that Yehudit's story is one of my favorite stories in Yad Vashem. Like Shifra, I also guide the museum. And the placement of the flag in the recipe book, which by the way, I sent you, Deborah, so we can share it afterwards. The placement of these two artifacts is in a small glass box between the hardships of life in concentration camps and the death marches. It's kind of halfway between the two. And you can almost overlook it because it's in a wall with many different artifacts. But all the artifacts on that specific wall speak to solidarity. In comparison to everything else in a very dark, literally dark museum, this is a beacon of light. And it's something that just, the first time I saw that I saw these two artifacts together, what actually drew me was the flag, the embroidered flag. I was like, what the hell? Why would anybody reuse a Nazi flag, right? It's just, there's something, yeah, I don't know, made my skin crawl. But then I asked myself, what is this tiny little book next to it? So being me, I had to find everything out about this. And the more I read Yehudit, the more I fell in love with this woman who had the most amazing sense of humor. And anytime she told anything that had to do with this recipe book, all that came out was like, the quantities. Oh my God, what were we thinking? Who would ever try to make this? And when Haviva takes the book to Yad Vashem, she at some point, she asks Yehudit, you know, maybe we'll start translating these recipes and we'll publish it as a little book and whatever. And Yehudit said, so are you out of your mind? Who will be able to make any of these? And to try and figure out what was the real recipe, that's like, I'm 80. You know? I don't care. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I know that Edith, and maybe Karen will talk about this later, but Edith had her own journey with her half of the booklet. So what drew me to this is the fact that everything that she goes through from the moment she comes to Ravensbruck is related to the other women. Up until that point, Yehudit lives this underground life, right? She's working for an ambassador, but it's lonely because she's constantly hiding who she is, what she is. She's a Jew, she's this, she's that, she's an immigrant from another country, this whole thing. The minute she gets to Ravensbruck, she has a community. It becomes something that lifts her up, right? I mean, and one of the other artifacts that she does end up donating to Yad Vashem is the note, the same note that Karen read us from the day in the infirmary. She's in an infirmary, which is also kind of a weird thing when you think about it. It's a labor camp in a concentration camp. Why would they have an infirmary? Well, they did because they needed working hands, and it's 1944. And the way the wars go for Germany ain't that great. So anybody has to be, you know, patched up and sent back to work. So, you know, the fact that she hangs on to this tiny piece of paper that was folded on top of the piece of bread that Edith gave her, that just shows like how much of a meaning this friendship, this kind of sisterhood that was created in their specific barrack. And it was all around the food. And when you guide the Holocaust, when you teach the Holocaust, you always talk about, you know, the worst possible things, and you had to steal from here and steal from there, and you're a lone wolf and you're alone in the world. But suddenly you end up in a barrack where everybody's together and everybody shares, like Karen told, everybody shares this bowl of soup when you need a bit of comfort, when you've had a bad day. And that to me is like a next level thing. So that was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
That was perfect. And And I love the idea that she had to end up essentially in prison before she really had a community.
Right.
So Karen, I don't know if you're monitoring the chat, but not surprisingly, what everybody is saying is, oh my gosh, Karen, I'm so hungry now. I want to make all the recipes that, well, first of all, of course, you tell this story like you read your poetry, and it just, it has that same feel. But the feel of the feel of the solidarity, but also there was something in the way you told it that made me really understand how this act of putting together this recipe book held them together and kept them alive and kept them human. And that's something that you talk about, that people talk about a lot, this act or that act kept them alive, kept them together, kept them human. But listening to you, I got it. I really felt that. I understood that. Talk to me about putting together this story and looking at it from this other angle. We've heard pieces of Yehudit's story in a number of our programs. We've never heard from Edith before, and so talk to us a little bit about Edith.
I feel that the relationship that Edith and Yehudit had, they were like sisters. And so this book, this endeavor, this enterprise that they entered into with other women, they sort of took them along and they kind of strengthened, they built their little family around this. I looked through some recipes, I should say, and I chose the ones that I felt, again, the savory and sweet, and then the pancake was interesting to me because of its many machinations and getting it down to teeny tiny little pieces. In reading about her, I just felt like she jumped out at me, that she, that I could inhabit her, that's.
You definitely inhabited her. Have you tried to make any of these recipes?
Oh my God, no. No, I'm not a great cook. I'm not the designated cook in my house, but I do have to say also that, the separation of the two of them and her going to Australia, but then the sweet rediscovery of each other. And even though they couldn't physically hug, they were still able to hear each other, hear the timbre of the voice, and to kind of relive some of these things. So
did they ever actually get together? They never.
No, I don't think that they did. I mean, that you can correct me if I'm wrong, but
No.
I think there was a lot of burning up phone lines and a lot of money that then, to make phone calls, I'm sure, every night.
And most of us probably remember this, but the cost of long distance in the 90s was very different than the cost of long distance now. I think there have been a couple of questions in the chat, but before we get to them, I want to show you
Yeah.
This is the cookbook, or the front of the cookbook. Yes, and Karen mentioned, or Edith mentioned the
Yes.
mushrooms, and I understand now why you said they're not poisonous, because they actually do look like poisonous mushrooms on this in this picture. And then I want to show you this one. This is the piece of the Nazi flag with everybody's signatures embroidered in it, and I think it's so brilliant that they did that they embroidered the signatures, because otherwise they would have long since faded. I can't. Lynn or Shifra, have you found Yehudit's or Edith's signature on here?
I once knew where the signature was.
I see foods, I see foods. I see like a turnip or and a honey pot maybe. I mean,
Yeah. I actually think Edith's. Oh, this is Edith's copy, so this would only have Edith's
on it, and it's
signature.
in the corner.
In the corner, that's right.
If
in here, in this corner down. Okay.
I don't know.
I don't know either. Lynn, I understand there was at least one question. I haven't seen it, but Jennifer said she sent it to you.
Yeah, so the question was the book ever published? So Edith's copy was never published. Edith did try to turn it into a form of a memoir, woven into her own testimony, but it was self-publishing, and there was a whole big hoo-ha, and it didn't actually make it to the shops, and the few copies that were printed were kept in her house.
Wow.
So if anybody ever ends up in Australia and somehow finds a copy, yeah, we want it. We'll pay for it.
Yeah, wow. Does Yad Vashem have a copy of that?
Yad Vashem does not have a copy of it.
I assume the Sydney
Sydney Museum has a copy, but it's not for loan. It's only for research purposes. You can actually go into their archives physically, not online. But Sydney Museum had scanned a few pages of the cookbook and put it up on their website and allowed Yad Vashem to share those images as well. I don't think anybody can actually make out what anything says there, and what the recipes really are. When we send our last email round, we used a copy of what is supposedly the rice souffle recipe. Again, I don't think you should attempt making it at home. But
I've seen other recipe books from similar recipe books, and they're not, you can't make the recipes. It just it doesn't work. And both of you really described this this feeling of how much sugar are you supposed to put in, Susanna wants to know if there's ever been an exhibit created around this story and this cookbook.
Shifra, do you want to talk about Spots of Light, or do you want me to do it? Okay, so Yad Vashem a couple of years ago had a all-women's exhibition. It was directed at International Women's Day, like our program today, and it highlighted different women. You can still see part of the exhibition online through the Yad Vashem website. I'll link it afterwards in the chat. So Yehudit and her recipe book were kind of spotlighted in a way. So the exhibition was kind of small. It had big posters, and one of the posters for Yehudit had Edith's letter. So basically Yad Vashem honored both women in this exhibition under the recipe book. So yes, Karen.
There are several books out there, cooking books.
Yeah.
It wasn't the only situation, Ravensbruck. And within Ravensbruck, there are probably 3 or 4 cooking books.
Oh,
that,
wow.
I mean, I don't know what survived, but they're because bunks and barracks, there were groups of women. So it wasn't, they weren't the only ones. So there are others out there. Yes.
Yes.
So Susanna asked about a particular cookbook, and as Jennifer said, the cookbook that Susanna was looking at, which she posted in the chat, looks like it's a cookbook from survivors. more than it's a cookbook from the camps. I just posted another one that I have seen before. It's called In Memory's Kitchen, which is a cookbook from Terrazin.
Mhm.
So this was something that happened in a number of different camps, and as Karen said, even different bunks within the same camp. I think it's a sort of an easy go-to, especially for women, many of whom probably had been. I mean, Edith said, you know, she didn't know how to cook, but I'm guessing that a lot of most of the women who were sharing these recipes were the cooks in their family, and this was something that they had been able to do in the past. So I think a lot of women probably went there.
And I think this idea of recollecting and Miriam's Kitchen, there are lots of books out there that are written after the fact, or maybe even during the fact, but were produced differently. It's just that this one it's a very unique story, I think.
Yes, this one has a unique story, and the connection of these two stories. You know, you hear a lot of different stories about people who haven't seen each other in 50 years and they get together in one way or another. And I mean, there's all these marvelous stories about survivors reconnecting. This particular one is interesting in a particular way because of the way it comes together through this artifact and through this this museum and the artifact director manager who manages to bring them together, and it's just such a beautiful story. Any other questions that people have?
Well, I also think the book as a character, my story begins with her being at the Sydney Museum, the Jewish Museum, and reuniting with the book. And so that whole relationship of not only, you know, we're people of the book, you know, so it's kind of like that. It was like so powerful that she would be reunited with this teeny tiny thing weighing nothing, just like brought everything back.
So tell us about that, because the impression I had sort of had from Haviva was that each of them had a copy of the book, or that there were two. I mean, Yehudit said
Two
there
parts.
were booklets. Can you tell us a little bit about Edith's journey to finding the other piece, or was she talking about seeing the Yehudit's half of the book?
You know, she's talking about when she went to this Jewish Sydney Museum, and I just sort of said it that way. I don't know. I just feel she's reunited with the book here. I don't know if she always had it in her possession. So that would be something, again, I'm not a historian. So that piece I'm sort of missing, but the way I set it up, she wanted to talk about it with people who came to the museum. She was asked to talk about it. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll just fill in the
Yeah.
little gap there is Edith keeps the book when she goes to Australia, and then she decides to donate it quite early on. She donates it well before Edith decides to part with her book, with her half of the book. So what Karen, where Karen starts her story starts from Edith actually saying that she was asked to come and talk and kind of explain what the book was and so on. Unfortunately, Yehudit never got to do that because the new Holocaust Museum at Yad Vashem opened 2 years after she passed. So she never got to actually do the same thing as Edith did. And there's a really interesting question in the chat that I'd like to pull in. And that was Sue's question about whether we coordinate and work together on the stories. So I have to say this was my obsession. It's all my fault. Tonight's my fault. But it actually started with me telling Karen about this letter and Karen liking the letter that Edith wrote to Yehudit, and I was talking to Shifra because we were talking about some exhibition at Yad Vashem, and kind of we were talking about how we guide solidarity, which is a thing on its own when you guide Holocaust. And it's like, oh, I want this story told in all different angles. And Karen and Shifra were gracious enough to say yes, that they would tell these stories. And we didn't, it's not rehearsed. It's not like the three of us sat together and did endless rehearsals. Each one worked on their part because each one is telling basically a different woman, but the thing that connects us is this book. So that obviously was the highlight.
And the thing that connects this is Lynne, who worked with both Shifra and Karen to form these stories and to bring this all together. This really was, as Lynne says, her brainchild, the idea of doing these three together, although I have to say when she suggested it to me, I jumped on it pretty quickly. There was an interesting question here about how much of the stories we heard is gathered from sources and how much is inferred or imagined to flesh out the stories. Lynne, do you want me to answer that, or do you want to answer that?
So, Teach the Shoah tells their stories in our voices. So this is, I can't say it's 100% their words because you try to modernize the language when you retell a story or when you tell a story, but it is 100% based on the true words of all three women. I think the only part which we can imagine is what these foods look like, because that's what the women did as well. They imagined the souffles and the tarts and the whatever, but it is really based on their I have to say both women did not give testimony, but both women were interviewed and talked to, so we could rely on their experiences to tell. So, and this is a thumb rule at Teach the Shoah. We don't imagine the story, we just tell it as the survivor or the victim chose to tell us.
In all of our programs, the stories you hear are all entirely true. They are not imagined. And while we might extrapolate small things like imagining what they might have been imagining when they described these recipes to each other, we are not making up or imagining any part of the story. We have another question here, which maybe is a question for Shifra. Were the letters they wrote to each other ever shown publicly or shared or exhibited?
So I'm not aware of them being available to the public. That doesn't mean that they are not kept under lock and key and shown to people who have a vested interest. So if you're a researcher, I'm sure you might be able to go in and look at them, but it's not something that you would have on display. One of the things that I know for a fact is that Yad Vashem tries to maintain as much privacy as they can. And I'm not sure what the intention of these letters were. They clearly were an intimate conversation between these two women. I don't know if it was spoken about as, do you mind if we publish this or anything like that? But I would assume that this was with the understanding that this was private conversation between two friends. And that's not something that I'm sure we're entitled to. I'm not sure that's something that is critical to the museum or to tell that story. I wanted to, as everyone was talking, I wanted to add one more piece about this story that I think everybody can relate to, is friends sort of picking up where they left off. And I would hope that all of us in our lives have women that we spent a week with or we spent a year with, but then life happens and we grow apart and we move away and we go to college or we go on different paths. But I do believe that what is so unique in women's relationship is the ability to sort of not see each other for 20 years or 50 years. And then you hear that woman's voice and this immediate connection that just comes flushing back, just running through you. And you're like, that's right. Now I understand. This is why we're soul sisters. And picking up right where you left off. And I think I've never heard of another story where where it's displayed so beautifully that you could have these women who had literally gone through hell together, and they just move on with their lives. And then they pick it up right where they left off. And I think that's something that is truly beautiful about this story and shows a lot about women's relationships with each other.
Yes, yes. As a story of women's solidarity, this combination of stories really shows us a whole series of things. The story in Karen's story about the solidarity bowl, right? You go around and everybody contributes a little bit and you give it to whoever needs it most. Wow. I mean, that's the story of solidarity, of hanging on to your humanity in the deepest way.
And also there was this dark humor in it that I truly appreciate. They were like, oh, you weren't feeling well. Well, we had this incredible buffet without you. Sorry you couldn't make it. Meanwhile, we're over here eating. Like, there was something so sarcastic, and they're teasing each other. There's like, you could tell they're women. They're like sort of going at each other at the same time, but it was meant with like the most beautiful rahmanis and kindness. Like, it wasn't mean, but this humor that they have with each other too, I think is just really great.
And love. It was
And
done,
love.
you know, and love. And so that when I decided to end with the letter, you know, of like being in this sumptuous meals, and here are the meals that we had in detail, and oh, you couldn't be there, but we brought you, you know, the only thing that was left was this piece of bread, you know. So
Yes.
funny. Both
Yeah,
of them,
hysterical.
I think, together are very
Hysterical.
funny. And
Yeah,
that's,
no,
I think that's also unusual, the lightheartedness,
yes.
the light touch with which the story can be told.
And
Yes.
Karen, I wanted to ask you about the comment about dumping it on your friend's head. Did that come out of her description?
No, it did not. I mean, I think that the whipping, I just imagined again. So I'm probably going to take a little more liberty than the historians here. But the idea that the bowl of whipping it to such a degree that it almost solidifies, so that you can, again, playfully dump it on the bowl of the person, you know, head of the person next to you.
Right. It certainly is within the playfulness of the relationship that they had and the relationships that they had.
It's very much a kind of thing that I could imagine Edith saying, from the way that Yehudit would describe their banter, right? Because they had a banter. I mean, there's many things, of course, that we choose not to tell in the story, but one of the things was they had this thing, these two young girls, they were quite young, right? They're sitting there and they're deciding which recipe goes in according to their own liking. And Edith doesn't even know how to cook, right?
It's godlike. It's godlike.
Yeah.
They even turn
Yeah,
people
no,
down who want to tell
It's
them.
so
Right.
snobby. I love it. They're like, really? I don't want this. This sounds gross. Like, I don't want this in my book. I love it.
I mean, there's this whole scene that Haviva actually mentions in her kind of testimonial around this whole story, is where she said that they had this whole argument, but Judith just felt so bad that this kind of she was a bit of an older woman. She must have been 30, right? With this older woman, right? You know, she really wants this recipe in the book, and the two of them are like, we'd never eat that. That sounds off and whatever.
Ew.
But yeah,
Well, I
but
said
Judith
that in
just-
mine. Yeah, in my
Right.
story, it's the pair. Yeah.
Right, the thing with the pair, that's exactly it. But then at the end, they decide she's older. We need to kind of respect the elder, right? So they put the recipe in, and they're kind of they begrudge it. They're not happy that they put it in because it took space on the page that could have been for another dessert that they would prefer. So they had this banter. So the flipping the bowl over somebody's head, right? That's the kind of thing that I could see the two of them kind of going, so you need to beat it and then I'll put it on your head, right?
Yeah, right,
It fits their
right.
banter.
Just make sure
yeah.
it's whipped enough. And when it's whipped enough,
Yeah.
Right, you can do that. Jill asked whether we would post the links, or we would, yeah, we would send the links to folks. Yes, we can do that, or we can post them on
We'll
our,
post up on our Facebook.
yeah, we'll post them on our Facebook page, when we post the, when this goes up, and you know what, Lynn, let's remember, we'll put them, this will go up on our YouTube channel in, a couple of days, and, when it does, we'll put them in the, notes of the video notes, on the
Sure.
YouTube channel. I think that with that, we will say thank you to everybody for coming and to our three amazing storytellers. And we will say good night. If you want to stay and chat for a few minutes after, we'll stay on and chat with anybody who wants to stay, just for a few more minutes. So good night, and thank you or good day for those of you in the US, and thank you for joining us.